Of Unit 8, and we are going to be talking about the 1970s. So we'll be talking a little bit about politics and what the economy looked like in the 1970s as we move into the 1980s, when you're going to have a big shift and a big change within the political world. So we left off with President Richard Nixon resigning after the Watergate scandal. President Gerald Ford would take over. Again, like I told you last class, Gerald Ford would be the first person to serve as both vice president and president without being elected for either one of those positions because of the resignation of Spiro Agnew and then Richard Nixon. So within the first month of office, Ford is going to do something that is really going to shake people's confidence in him, and also is going to be what is going to cost him probably being reelected or elected for the first time as president. And he would do that by granting Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any crime that he might have committed. Many people looked at this and said, look, the only reason that Nixon resigned is that him and Ford would have had to have worked out some sort of deal where if Nixon resigned, Ford would become president and then pardon him. And a lot of people looked at it as another corrupt bargain, going back to like the election of 1824 that we talked about. Ford, though, he explained and wrote extensively about why he pardoned Nixon. And really, he said that the reason that he did that was to end the national nightmare that we were going through. I mean, again, think about Watergate at this point had been going on for a couple of years. And he says, you know, we need to heal as a country and put this behind us. Also, another one of his reasons for pardoning Nixon was he believed that it would be bad for the country to go throughout this long, drawn-out process of having Nixon put on trial. And he thought that this would be the best way to just get rid of it, just put this behind us as a country. So Ford would pardon him. And again, Ford, most people generally liked Ford. They thought he was a good guy. But because of this is going to be cost him ever being elected president as a result. Now, one of the things you're going to see is that both Ford and Congress are interested in investigating and knowing what other things were going on within the government. So the Democratic Congress continued to search for abuses of executive powers, especially within the CIA. If you remember, the CIA had been used strategically throughout the world. And so people started looking at the CIA and saying, like, what exactly are they doing? Especially, are they participating in the assassination of foreign leaders? You would see in Chile that there would be a coup there that led to the suicide of the Marxist president. That coup, a lot of people, and actually his history shows that the CIA had been involved in that as well. So Ford put somebody that everybody believed could be trusted and was known to be a pretty good guy, Texas Congressman George H.W. Bush. He would be put into the charge of the CIA to oversee and hopefully to help reform the CIA from within. You're also going to see some failed U.S. foreign policy during this time. In April 1975, remember under Nixon, we had done Vietnamization and pulled out of Vietnam. But April 1975, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, would fall to the communists, and Vietnam would now be a unified communist country. So really, if you had any question over whether or not we had succeeded or failed in Vietnam, a lot of people look at this as the indication of that we failed because Vietnam became a unified communist country. We would work extensively to evacuate Vietnamese out of South Vietnam that wanted to get out, that were not happy about being under a communist regime. So we would evacuate around 150,000 Vietnamese people out of South Vietnam. Also in 1975, you're going to see the U.S.-supported government in Cambodia would fall to the Khmer Rouge, which is a radical communist group and probably, again, one of the most one of the 20th century's largest genocides outside of the Holocaust. You'd have the Khmer Rouge killing over 1 million of their own people in a genocide, an attempt to rid the country of any Western influence. If you ever want to do any more research into this, I put a couple of pictures on here of the areas that were known as the killing fields there. And these are areas where the Khmer Rouge took the Cambodian people and would kill them in mass numbers. And actually, if you visit any of these killing fields today, which have all become memorials, actually still sometimes they still have bones that wash up or that are unearthed as a result of all the killing that happened in those places. So again, pretty terrible thing that happened there within Cambodia. Now, you'll see the lone bright spot within Asia would be what got known as the little tigers of Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia. All of those countries did not fall to communism and kept a very good relationship with the United States, so they were seen as the lone bright spot there. Some people point to Vietnam and say that it was successful in that it did keep communism from spreading other places in Asia. Again, that just kind of depends on how you look at it. These are some pictures here from the fall of Saigon, and actually they were trying to evacuate so many people out that it led to some issues. One is they didn't have enough room actually on the Air Force carriers and other things that they had there to land all the helicopters of people coming. So you had these stunning images here where they actually, sailors within the ship are actually pushing U.S. helicopters into the ocean so they can make room for other helicopters to land to rescue people from Saigon there. And then that famous picture there, you can see people moving up the ladder there, going to the helicopter because they want to evacuate and to get out of there. If you ever have a chance, I've visited the Gerald Ford Presidential Museum and library in Grand Rapids, Michigan. They actually have, I think, that ladder there that was used to evacuate people out of Saigon. So, all right, Ford's domestic policies. You're going to see that Ford was more conservative than Nixon was. His chief concern really was to bring inflation under control. Unfortunately for him, inflation would continue and the economy would sink deeper into recession. One of the things, though, one of the bright spots of the 70s, you could say, is 1976. You'd have the 200th anniversary or the 200th birthday of the United States. And in a lot of ways, this helped people to celebrate and helped people to put Watergate and Vietnam behind them as they focused on the bicentennial of our nation. So again, that was good for people, again, to another thing to help take their mind off of what was going on. We talk about inflation during this time. I mentioned last class a little bit about the gas crisis that was going on, the oil crisis, and you can see here showing the average gas prices, and you can see how they can shoot up during this time, but also you have inflation there as well. Again, those are going to be one of those things that's really going to affect the economy. So that brings us to the election of 1976. Gerald Ford, he would actually be challenged for the Republican nomination by Ronald Reagan. Remember, we talked about Reagan in the election of 1964. Ford would win the nomination, but the conflict that he had with Reagan during the nomination process really did hurt him politically. And the Democrats decided to go a little bit different this time and say, hey, we want to pick somebody that's a Washington outsider. You know, all this junk that's been going on with D.C., we think it would benefit to pick somebody that isn't involved in D.C. So the former governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, he would run in the nomination process, and he would be picked to run by the Democrats. Again, he was a Washington outsider. He ran on being an outsider and on cleaning up the corruption within D.C. there. Now, if you look at the voting here, you'll see that it was actually pretty close. You look at the popular vote there, less than 1 million votes. Actually over 1 million votes, but under 2 million votes separate the two parties there. That's why I believe that if Ford hadn't pardoned Nixon, that Ford probably would have won the presidency here. But again, that upset and made a lot of people angry there. So you will see that there with the election in 1976. And that brings us to President Carter. Now, President Carter was known as the peanut farmer because that's what some of what he had done back when he lived in Georgia growing up. And just to show you a little bit of a difference with him, as he brought kind of a humility to the office. So, for example, on Inauguration Day, instead of riding the presidential limo from the Capitol to the White House, Carter and his wife would walk down Pennsylvania Avenue instead of riding in that limo. He was also known to frequently carry his own luggage. I got a picture there of him about to get on the presidential helicopter, and you can see he's carrying his own luggage there. So again, quite the contrast coming from like Nixon and this whole idea of an imperial presidency where he kind of set in the White House in the high tower. You have Carter, that's someone that's more kind of like a common person. Now, Congress was viewed, or Carter was viewed, not Congress. Carter was viewed in D.C. as an outsider, and a lot of people felt that he paid too much attention to the details of the operation of the government, and really that hindered him and a lot of things that he wanted to do as president. And in fact, they have one congressman who says, basically, if you talk about, you missed the forest because of the trees, they said that Carter missed the forest because of the leaves. That's how focused he was on the day-to-day specifics of government operation. All right. The big focus, and probably the area you'll see some of the most success for Jimmy Carter, is going to be in diplomacy and in foreign policy. And he had what he called human rights diplomacy, which meant that he was going to focus on human rights throughout the world. So, for some examples, he would oppose the oppression of the black majority in South Africa, in Rhodesia. In South Africa, you had the apartheid going on there. He opposed that. He actually also cut off U.S. aid to Argentina and Chile due to human rights violations that were happening under the governments there. Another thing that Carter wanted to correct was the Panama Canal Treaty of 1903. Under that original treaty that was under Teddy Roosevelt that we got, we kept control of the Panama Canal and did everything with the Panama Canal as far as administering that. Carter would negotiate a new treaty with Panama. The Senate would ratify that. And basically the process of that would be to gradually transfer ownership of the canal over to Panama. And it would have to be completed by the year 2000, which it would be completed in 1999. So again, he's trying to correct some issues that he sees around the world. Also in 1978, now this right here is going to be the greatest accomplishment of Jimmy Carter's presidency. Carter, at the indication of the president of Egypt during this time, had indicated that he might be for, coming up with some sort of reconciliation with Israel. Remember, the two of them had fought in a 6-day war in 1967, and the relationship between Israel and Egypt had never been good. So after getting some of those indications from the president of Egypt, Carter would invite both the Israeli prime minister and the president of Egypt to Camp David, Maryland, which is the presidential retreat, to work on a peace treaty between the two nations. Carter would act as an intermediary in this between the two leaders and help step in when needed to help craft a framework for a peace settlement between the two countries. And you would see in 1979, Egypt would become the first Arab nation to recognize the nation of Israel. Most places in the Middle East, actually all places in the Middle East to this point had not recognized Israel as a country at all, and a lot of them viewed it as stolen land from Palestine. Israel would withdraw troops as part of the agreement from the Sinai territory. Again, that had been taken from Egypt during the 6-day war. So as part of this agreement, they did agree to withdraw from that area. So this is a big deal. I don't know if you pay attention to the news, but there's still a lot of conflict and issues in the Middle East. So anytime that you can do anything to bring some semblance of peace to the Middle East, that's a good thing. And that's why, again, people look at this as Jimmy Carter's greatest accomplishment. Now, we talked about his greatest accomplishment. Now we can talk about probably his greatest failure. The Iran hostage crisis. So if you remember back when we had talked about that the U.S. had helped in Iran for an overthrow of the government there. The CIA had helped back that and helped overthrow the government there that had become hostile to Western nations. There was still a lot of hostility in the Middle East or in Iran towards the United States because of that. And so in 1979, you would have Islamic fundamentalists led by the Ayatollah Khomeini overthrow the leader who was the Shah of the Iranian government. One of the first things that they do when they take over is that they stop oil production, causing the second worldwide oil shortage of the decade. So we had talked about the earlier one, and now you're going to have a second major one. November of that same year, the Iranian military would seize the U.S. embassy and take 50 to 59 people of the American staff hostage. Now, this would drag on the rest of President Carter's administration. Again, there would be an election in 1980, but he tried over and over and over again to negotiate and get these hostages back. Nothing worked. He attempted to do a military operation, and that floundered and failed in a big way. So these hostages would not be released under Carter's administration. So again, this led to a lot of people who looked at Carter as a very weak leader because of this. Now, with the Cold War, you're going to see Carter did attempt to continue the Nixon-Ford policy of détente, which was reducing tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. In 1979, we would end recognition of the nationalist government, Chinese government of Taiwan. I remember we talked about when China fell in the late 40s, how the nationalists went out to Taiwan. We ended recognition of that government, and we would exchange ambassadors with China for the first time. December of 1979, Soviet troops would invade Afghanistan. Carter would react by putting in place an embargo on certain things and by boycotting the 1980 Olympics, which were in Moscow. But again, people looked at that as a very weak response to the Soviets invading Afghanistan like they did. Now, if you ever wonder about Afghanistan, again, Afghanistan, interesting place. Of course, we have been fighting in there since September 11th. But Afghanistan, the Soviets were never actually, even though they invaded Afghanistan, they were never actually able to take over Afghanistan. And you'll see the Soviets tried and could never take it over. I mean, it was almost a decade that they attempted to try to take over Afghanistan and were not able to be successful in doing so. Later on, under Reagan's administration, the U.S. government will help to funnel some funds into Afghanistan to help them fight against the Soviets there. But that's just an interesting side note in history that Soviets were never able to take over Afghanistan in the way they wanted. And you're going to see later down the road, when we go in and try to root out the terrorists that are there, that we would also have difficulties. Now, the economy in the 1970s, not very good. GDP decreased. You'd have stagflation, which is a combination of unemployment and inflation, but that would increase. You would also see increasing deindustrialization. More and more competition was coming from German and Japanese industries, which is interesting. Again, both industries we had helped rebuild after World War II. And so you're going to see deindustrialization really, really hurts the country, especially the Rust Belt, which is your areas like Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Those areas are going to be hit the hardest. Again, think about it. Those areas are the areas that have a lot of vehicle production. And we talked about how with the first oil crisis that people started moving towards more fuel-efficient Japanese vehicles, which really left the American automakers in a lot of trouble because they didn't have anything really to compete with that at that time. So again, the oil crisis hurt. Also, you're going to see inflation. Inflation is going to cause something called the taxpayers' revolt. Because of inflation, that pushed a lot of middle-class taxpayers into high tax brackets. So because of this, people start paying more taxes, and they are very unhappy. So you're going to see taxpayers start pushing to eliminate and lower taxes. Probably one of the most famous examples is that you would have in California Proposition 13, which would roll back property taxes, cap future increases, and limited all tax measures had to be passed by a 2/3 vote in the California legislature there. So again, economy is not good. And again, you're having people push against taxes, not liking these high taxes. And you can kind of see this is going to kind of pave the way for Reagan and the conservative revolution that we will start talking about in the next unit. Also during this time, you're going to see a growth of immigration. The Immigration Act of 1965 ended the ethnic quotas that had been in place since basically the 1920s, opening up immigration from all around the world. And as a result, by the 1980s, you're going to see 47% of immigrants came from Latin America, 37% from Asia, and less than 13% from Europe and Canada. It had pretty much been the reverse before that most of our immigration came from Europe and Canada, and you can kind of see that reflected on that chart there as well. Also, by the mid-1970s, you're starting to see that we were having an immigration crisis on the southern border. 12 million foreigners were in the U.S. legally. You would actually see Congress and the president work together to pass some immigration reform. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 would penalize employers that hired people that were in the country illegally while offering amnesty to those who had entered illegally prior to 1982. So you would see that they actually did work on that, although when you look at our current state of politics and immigration, especially over the southern border, again, that continues to be an issue. But yeah, again, they tried to do something about it during Carter's administration. The environmental movement. You're going to see that the first Earth Day would be celebrated in 1970 and really reflects the nation's concern over air and water pollution. You would have several disasters that would happen, including within Chicago or in Cleveland. You would have the Cuyahoga River catch on fire. Yes, a river caught on fire because of all the pollution in it. And then you would have some other ones throughout the 70s and 80s that really would change public opinion on the environment, and it would become more something that people would pay more attention to. In 1979, you'd have the 3 Mile partial meltdown of a nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania. 1986 in the Soviet Union, you'd have the Chernobyl nuclear reactor explosion and meltdown there, which Chernobyl today is open. You can actually go there and explore it, but there's still high levels of radiation there. I don't think it's enough to actually injure you. You're just not supposed to be there for too long. And then in 1989, you would have the Exxon Valdez oil tanker accident in Alaska, where you would have tons and tons of oil spilled into the ocean there in Alaska. If you want to, you can go look up images of that. I still remember that, even though I was 5 years old. I can still remember some of those images, seeing of like the animals covered in oil, the seals, and all that kind of stuff as a result of this. So you will see a push and a start in the environmental movement. Now, 1970, Congress would pass the Clean Air Act and create the EPA. Again, this was done prior to Carter. This was done during the Nixon administration. That would be followed by the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. And again, with that, remember when we talked about Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the book that she wrote, the AP exam loves to mention that one, by the way. That was one of those things that helped pave the way for this. Then in 1972, in response to Ralph Nader, we talked about him writing the book Unsafe at Any Speed, you would have the Consumer Product Safety Commission founded to help with that as well, and to ensure that consumer products were safe, especially automobiles and that kind of thing. So that brings us to the election of 1980. You're going to have President Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan would win the nomination for this, and you're going to see that Carter was a very unpopular president at this point. Remember, the economy was bad. He was viewed weak in a lot of ways in foreign policy due to the Iran hostage crisis and what was going on within Afghanistan. And really, Americans blamed him for weak and indecisive leadership and the very poor economy. And so you can see as a result of that, if you look there in the election results, probably you hadn't had this big of a trouncing of an incumbent president since Herbert Hoover. And again, Herbert Hoover, that was the background of the Great Depression was going on during that time. So Reagan wins big and very, very convincingly in this election here. And we're going to start out this next unit really talking about the impact of Reagan and what exactly Reagan's presidency would do for the future of America and the future of politics in America there. So again, that's the end of Unit 8, and we are going to jump into Unit 9 in a couple class periods here and start talking about the Reagan Revolution. I hope you have a great day.